The other day I got a call from my oldest son. He said he needed to talk about a problem he was having. He has been married just under 3 years and is afraid that his wife is fooling around. Since I have experience with this kind of thing, he is confident that I can help him. I think I can. To be honest, I haven't thought about it in a long time, but he is my son and his mother and I have had our own problems. It wasn't that long ago. In fact, I had to reflect back in the 1990s to come to any conclusion. I am proud of my boy. I'm proud of all my kids. If he needs fatherly advice, I'll try to share what I have. I think I'll just sit down and try to go back and refresh my memory. Maybe I'll jot down some notes. I want to be ready when he comes. We'll see. Part 1. First love. I met the woman I considered my one true love back in high school when I was in 10th grade. Her name was Manning, and believe me, she was just the cat's meow. Long blonde hair, not very large, but well-built body and brilliant blue eyes. She was one of the most popular girls in our class. We were the same age. Every guy was chasing after her and me. My name was Brad Were. I was skinny, a little tall, and probably a gangster. She wasn't interested in me at all. I couldn't blame her. I was shy, socially inferior, not particularly athletic, and not particularly artistic or musical. The first time I saw her was at her 16th birthday party. Her boyfriend at the time was a senior, 2 years older than her, a real jerk named Vernon Smithers. Everyone had met the type. He worked on cars all the time, so his fingernails were always in putty, lifted weights until his head was too small for his torso, had greasy black hair, and spent most of his free time on the corner snapping and snapping at the younger guys. He always had the same catchphrase. If anyone dared look in his direction, he would scowl and say, "What are you looking?" And he only had two things going for him: a part-time job and a car. I hated him, so she was at her party. I swear she looked like a goddess. She saw me. I was way across the room. I wasn't even invited. I came with another guy who knew her. She didn't know me from Adam, but she looked right at me, smiled, and slipped through the crowd, stood right in front of me, then leaned forward and kissed me. Then, without saying a word, she made an 80 turn and walked back to her boyfriend. I saw him. If he had a gun, I'd be dead. Oh yes, I had an enemy, but I didn't care. I was desperately and hopelessly in love. She must have known it too, because she tilted her head slightly and looked at me before turning back to her boyfriend. She must have said something about me, because he glanced in my direction and gave me one of those predatory "I'm so much better than you" smiles. Carol reminded me of that girl in the movie Footloose. She may not have been in bed yet, but she sure had been kissed a lot. She was way out of my league. I remembered Mrs. Warheim, my English teacher. She was a Dickens fanatic. It was as if Carol was a Stella and I was P. She was an unapproachable beauty and I was a dirty boy. It didn't matter. I didn't care. I had to have her. I was willing to do anything, but I had to make her mine. So one by one, guy by guy, I gradually managed to outrun all my competitors. By the time we got to prom, it was just her and me, yeah, and it helped that her parents made her stop dating. Vernon, graduation came. We got our diplomas and went to the beach. We were old enough and finished what we started together. Talk about the glory days. September came and I started applying to college. I wanted to be a School teacher, a math teacher, Carol. Wanted to be a nurse. I went to a community college and she got a room in one of the dorms at one of the large hospitals downtown. Over the next 4 years we had our ups and downs. Besides classes, I had to work, and Carol lived 20 m away, so we didn't see each other very often. I think I also got a few doses of maturity from my home life. For one thing, my father collapsed at work one day, a massive brain hemorrhage. He was kept in the emergency room for days with ice on him. They had to open him up and take out some of the brain tissue. Had left a dent in his head. The company he worked for gave him a small severance package and then let him go, leaving us all to fend for ourselves. Dad became crippled and spent the rest of his life sitting in a chair. Sometimes Mom had to help him with meals. He'd get angry and shout a bunch of barely intelligible swear words, or just sit there with tears streaming down his cheeks. He could have sued, but he wasn't litigious. Besides, he was proud, so he never sought any kind of government assistance. Mom had to go out to work, and I had to help my siblings. I had and still have a younger brother and a younger sister. Without my dad's strong hand, my younger brother Todd fell on hard times. He was skipping school and his grades went down the toilet. Mom had to go to the police station one day to get him out of there. The younger sister, her name was Susan, was a real heartache for several years. I guess she was a lot like Carol. Susan was too pretty and popular too soon, and that attracted all the wrong guys. Mom and I had a hard time keeping her afloat. A couple times I had to secretly follow her in the car to keep her away from one guy who was too old for her. Todd and I caught up with him one night, had a long talk, and the guy agreed to stay away, and that was a good thing because Todd loved to fight. Poor Dad just watched helplessly. It was pathetic. Dad was such a strong man, a real role model. He held us all together. I did my best, but I was never like him. It was Mom who broke my heart. Dad was already sitting in his chair, and Mom still had her own needs. There was a small tavern a couple blocks from our house, and Mom started sneaking there to get laid every now and then. Sometimes she would get home late from work and tell us it was because of mandatory overtime. Other times she would come home at the usual time, clean herself up, put on something nice, slip out the back door, and disappear for 2 or 3 hours. My father knew but never said anything. He was a proud man, and I knew what she did hurt him. I think in the end it helped him. Dad died when I was still in college. His death affected my mom in the most profound way, even though he was crippled. And even though she did horrible things, she really loved him. After he died, she cried all the time, did nothing but work, stopped eating, lost interest in everything, and just hung around the house. I think the guilt and loss almost killed her. It's true, you don't know what you have until you lose it. Back to Carol and me, we broke up a few times, but after what was usually a short break, we managed to get things back on track. I never gave it much thought at the time, but now looking back, I realized that our separations were probably times when she thought she had found someone else to play with. I never did anything like that. She was all I ever wanted, but I had my suspicions about her. I mean, I cared. I was just lying, and it bothered me. I was being faithful. I wanted her to stay faithful. But we weren't married. We didn't get engaged until the spring of my senior year, and I couldn't prove anything Anyway, about proof, I guess I went a little overboard once. I didn't own her. I couldn't force her to be faithful, but one day during my junior year, my suspicions took over. We were long distance, and I sure she was up to something. I kept calling, trying to talk to her, trying to make up, but all my calls were intercepted by her friends from nursing school. They would yell at me and lecture me about how unfair I was being, and that even though Carol really loved me, she needed to be art. Sometimes they told me she was there in the dorm, but she was so sad and miserable that all she did was cry and confess to them how rude I was to her. I was never rude to her. I meant it. I was always a little insecure when it came to Carol. It's hard to be immortal in love with a goddess. I started going into town to see what was going on. If anything, I didn't get anywhere. Carol had a car, but she kept it in one of those big private garages. The only way to find out that her car was gone was to park the car and walk through all the levels. The only thing I could do was sit in the car outside the hospital or drive around it to see if I could catch her. The only thing I was able to do was drive myself crazy, but I loved her so much. It was awful. My dad would sit in a chair at home and watch my mom go in and out, and I would drive around and know nothing. Sometimes I wondered who had it worse. I think it was Dad. Eventually I graduated and got a job as a high school math teacher, and Carol got a job at a pediatric clinic near where we grew up. We got married, had a beautiful wedding, and finally hit the road. A few months passed and Carol became pregnant. Our first child was a boy, and we named him after me. A couple of years after that came a girl. We named her Bridget after Carol's mom. With 2 children in the family, Carol decided that instead of having her tubes tied, she would take the pill. I, not wanting to be impregnated, agreed. It didn't occur to me at the time that her decision not to get her tubes tied might someday lead to trouble. Life went on, and that was a good thing. We bought a small starter home in a quiet old neighborhood. Since we had her mom, Carol never took time off from work because of pregnancy or child care. Carol stayed at the clinic and took over supervision while I got several promotions, eventually becoming principal and moving to a new large middle school. Throughout this time, we were always close. I mean, no extended meetings or workshops out of state. Every once in a while I would be recalled for a few days, and once or twice Carol would get a chance to supplement her education by spending the night at one of the big hospitals in town. What I meant by that was I was there and she was there, so there were no old excuses like you're never around or we hardly ever see each other. It was just the same trouble that came along. Around the time Junior went into 6th grade, I started to realize that something wasn't right. I could have sworn that our normal interaction hadn't changed much, but I was sure that something wasn't as it should be. What was it that made me raise my eyebrows? I think it was the little things, the things I saw in my mom. It was the other thing that bothered me. We were always talking. We talked about the kids and vacations and our long-term plans. Kids, vacations, bills, household needs were still on the table, but we stopped talking about long-term plans. That is, Carol still looked a few days and weeks ahead, but anything a year or 2 ahead stopped taking up any time. It probably sounds silly, but we've had our share of camping trips. We went from tent to cot and explored trailers for a while. Carol talked about saving vacation and work time for a long drive across the country. She seemed excited for a while, but then it stopped. I was still talking about things like the Grand Canyon and Monument Valley, but she stopped participating. I'd mentioned something, asked her a couple questions, and she'd sort of stutter and dodge the answer. She would nod nervously, agree, and then answer something like, yeah, but the thing is, we're sure, yeah, but it's not a good time. When she spoke like that, I noticed that she never looked at me. She wasn't looking ahead like I was. Perhaps she had other plans. This was before the widespread availability of affordable cell phones, GPS units, and laptops, and the internet was in its infancy. So modern concepts of electronic surveillance were still just looming on the horizon. At least in my mind, there were no private investigators either. First, the idea of spying on my wife was anathema to me, and second, Carol handled the money. Doesn't that worry you? It should. Carol handled the money. We had a checking account, but I never used it. We had one credit card that we both used, and besides, most things were still done in cash. I used the card to pay for gas and trips to the lumber mill, but groceries and other items were paid for with green paper. Carol did the shopping, bought the kids' clothes, and paid the bills. From time to time, I would ask, are we all right? And Carol always answered, we're fine. It wasn't the money, not in the beginning, that was the real wake-up call. I was the school principal, and that meant things like PTA and sports. Fall meant soccer on Friday, soccer and hockey after school. Winter meant basketball and volleyball, and spring meant baseball, lacrosse, and track and field. Of course, I couldn't get to every game, but I was expected to attend most of them, and that left Carol home alone with the kids. From time to time, I had to rethink that a bit. There were a few occasions when I had to be absent, and so did Carol. For me, there was the Middle States Commission on Secondary Schools, as well as the Southern Region Board of Education. These two organizations were empowered to set up temporary committees that periodically visited participating high schools. As a school principal, I was required to participate periodically as a specialist, sometimes in administration, sometimes in math, in visiting the various schools. These visits could take as much as a week away from home. Carol, being a supervisor, also had to be away from home from time to time. I never believed that anything would come out of these trips. Perhaps I was wrong. I'll never know. Nevertheless, Carol stayed home alone with the children, or was she? 2 houses down lived Jenny M.C. Furl, 16 years old, mature, and ready to work as a nanny. I suspect something started in the fall when the youngest was in 6th grade. Bridget was in 4th grade, and I had Friday night soccer. Carol was good at her job, but not smart. She had coworkers, and I had my soccer. It was too easy. I could stay late at school and stay for the game, or come home, grab a snack, change, and leave. Sometimes, weather permitting, I would even take my kids with me. Believe me, if I took my kids to a soccer game, it was very beneficial to them. They could socialize with the older kids, and there was always a bunch of junior high or high school girls ready to butter up the principal and play babysitter. Either way, Jenny M. Fertile or high school girls, it was good for me, good for our kids, and good for Carol. Only for her in a different way. I didn't want to prolong the conversation with my son, so I decided to lay it out as clearly as possible. I remember finding out that there were 2 kinds of romances: the first was the sneaky small tryst and the second was the poorly known affair on the road, and the trick of it all was that a dirty little tryst could escalate into something worse. Here's what was really unpleasant. I was essentially a school teacher, and Carol worked among doctors, and that mattered. Doctors, for the most part, are wonderful people. They help people. Teachers too, but doctors save lives. There's clearly something to complicate things. Here both teachers and doctors are pretty well educated, but doctors, as I said, deal with life and death, or at least sometimes with serious medical problems, and are always looked upon with great reverence. Teachers also get some respect, but not as much as doctors. This difference can be devastating, especially if someone's family is at stake. I'll digress a bit. My father worked in a warehouse, and Carol's father was a plumber. In short, we both came from working class backgrounds. Doctors were highly respected in our families, very highly respected. As a professional, I worked with children. Carol's co-workers were doctors. I was dazzled by the purity of innocent young minds. Carol was blinded by self-righteous, godlike beings in white who were rarely, if ever, wrong. Unfortunately for me and my family, one of these dazzling creatures turned out to be a doctor who specialized in treating childhood cancer. Of course, no math teacher turned school principal, regardless of the complexity of the quadratic equation, could ever match the surgeon who saved the lives of little boys and girls suffering from diseases like leukemia. I never thought of Carol as calculating. I think I was wrong. In fact, I was decidedly and undeniably wrong. One day I met Dr. Maynard Gilmore at one of Carol's professional events. I took a liking to him. He struck me as an affable and trustworthy man. He was unmarried, as I later learned, divorced. But that meant nothing at the time. After a dozen years of marriage and children, I trusted my wife. I had faith in her. I was a fool. Not that I seriously suspected any infidelity, emotional or otherwise. I didn't look around for any signs. There were, I noticed, but I honestly didn't suspect anything. It was Carol's stupidity, or rather her carelessness, that turned everything around. So every Friday night, with or without the kids, I went to soccer. Then winter came and it was basketball time. Carol was good, but something was going on. She made it through the soccer season without giving anything away, but basketball games rarely fell on a Friday. There were times on a Friday or two, but more often than not they were late afternoon games played on Thursdays. Somewhere along the way, I guessed that Carol didn't stick to some sort of reliable schedule. Carol used to stick to Fridays, but now often went out on other evenings as well. I was often home when she came in from short dates with co-workers. My recollection now is that there was a child there, a high school student, who needed to retake a health class, and his retake was scheduled for 2 days a week, Mondays and Wednesdays. Health was usually a 3-day class. The kid decided he could skip Monday, and the teacher would decide he only needed 1 hour. The kid started skipping Mondays, then he got careless and started showing up on Mondays and skipping Wednesdays. The teacher suspected something was wrong, checked his records for September, and the kid got reprimanded for it. He paid with detention and 3 days of health for the rest of the year. Believe me, the night it all finally came out on her, it wasn't the smell of alcohol on her breath, the indifference to our long-term plans, the blind rush to get Past the kids and me when she came home. After that night out with friends, it was her outfit. Carol was always something of a clothes horse. She always had to have the latest styles, the prettiest blouses, the prettiest dresses. Her hair always had to be put up in a special style. Her nails had to be painted and her makeup had to look special. So why did she come home that night looking so campy? Why was her makeup so sloppy? Why was her hair so disheveled? And what were those stains on her skirt and blouse? The first time or two I didn't pay attention, to be honest. At first I didn't notice or pretended not to notice, but pretty soon I had the right signals. Finally, I asked her, Carol, what happens to you on those nights when you come home late? She looked at me kind of dumbfounded. I realized she was drunk. She said, what do you mean? I said, look at yourself. What have you been doing? Where have you been? You look like you've been in a mud wrestling contest. She replied, just out with friends. Annoyed, impatient, I asked, really? With who? She told me. She mentioned several names, including a couple of doctors, one of whom was Mayor Gilmore. I asked her, excuse me, Carol, but you don't look well. What's wrong? As I said, she was quite drunk, not falling over, but definitely not herself. Everyone knows that alcohol affects a person's self-control. They become more relaxed, less restrained. She was out of line. She was standing there in our living room. The kids had already gone to bed, and she said, for heaven's sake, Brad, you know I know you. No, I replied. No, Carol, I don't know, and frankly, I didn't know. And then she dropped the bomb, me and Dr. Gilmore. You know, that's when I realized I felt like someone had just walked across my grave. I needed to hear more. No, Carol, what do you mean, you and Dr. Gilmore? Then she started crying. She sat up and said, I'm sorry, Brad. My first reaction was, that can't be true, but it was like Dickens. There had been better times an hour before, but not now. She sobbed a few times, then said, Dr. Gilmore and me, well, us, Brad, I'm so sorry. We love each other. My world had just come to an end. I was trapped in the lunette. The blade was coming down my head, was falling into the basket. It's funny what thoughts rush through a person's brain at such moments. I remembered reading once that after decapitation, a person retains some semblance of consciousness for up to 7 seconds. Come to think of it, those were my 7 seconds. Imagine 7 seconds from life to something else. I had no idea what I was supposed to say or do. Something just sort of washed over me. It was like a powerful electric current, a brief, overwhelming surge, and then I was dead. I just knew this what had been us. We was over. I said, you're leaving me. I said it just like that. I said it, and I knew it was true. No preparation, no preparation, no preparation, no secrecy, nothing. 1 minute I was married, I had a wife, I had a family and a home, and the next nothing. An abyss. Looking back, I realized it was much worse than that night. I was in a complete state of distress. I remember not crying, not begging, not pleading, not asking, but I remember how I felt, and it was bad, horrible, but not as bad as it could have been. Carol was sitting there, hair mess, blouse wrinkled, mouth smelling awful, and she said, yes, Brad, I guess it is. I remembered that she was trying to portray a let's have some sympathy attitude. I've seen teachers play the same game with kids year after year. To me, it was old. Had she sat for a while, recovered a bit, but given that she was still stoned, she said, Brad, I love you. I've always loved you. I'm just not in love with you. anymore. That hit me with an old joke me hour. Marriage, it had become a glitch. I went from being stunned to thoroughly pissed off. No, it wasn't anger. It was rage. It was blind rage. It was time to strike back. I remember looking around the room, and the first thing I saw was her locker. Well, it had to be clean, standing up and heading for her precious collection of heirlooms. I yelled, "You got 'em!" __. I got to the closet a little before she did. She knew what I was up to. She was only one microc late. I grabbed one of the side flaps and yanked as hard as I could. It was a fragile antique heirloom. The damn door came right off. My hands found themselves inside, grabbing for her precious moments. Waterford candlestick, Swarovski vase, my grandmother's old trinkets, they all went flying everywhere. I broke every damn thing I could reach, and I did it with malice. With deep anger, Carol was screaming and crying, begging me to stop, but I was just getting started. It only took a few seconds to destroy the wild card. Then I moved on to the TV, the stereo, and the paintings. I smashed everything. I nabbed the wall cabinet in the dining room, the good china, the husband and wife dolls under a plastic dome, the special gifts, the crystal wine glasses. I charged and she followed me. I pushed her away and ruined everything on the wall. I saw a picture. Everyone has a picture like that, a happy bride and groom in their wedding attire. It was in my lap. I ripped the picture out and tore it to shreds. I threw it around like it was confetti. I shouted, "Yay, it's over!" And then I went to the kitchen to the damn knickknacks she had scattered all over the damn kitchen. Her little baby things. I wasn't angry anymore. I didn't feel anything. I didn't care. Everything had to go. I picked up one kitchen chair after another and smashed them against everything I could reach. I reached down to the floor, pulled out the everyday china, and started tossing it in all directions. I broke off the gooseneck faucet. She followed me, crying, begging. She didn't understand. Every little thing, every piece of furniture, every plate, every glass were they hers. I opened the refrigerator and everything inside was soon outside. Milk, iced tea, leftover chicken, half and half. It was everywhere. I was going crazy. Then it all stopped in the gap between the kitchen and the dining room stood my two children. They looked scared. Bridget said something, I think. She said, "Daddy." I collapsed onto the last unbroken kitchen chair and began to sob. I mean, howl like a little baby. Carol put the kids to bed and went back into the kitchen. I was still crying, but not her. No, Carol wasn't crying. Carol was in full __ mode. She stood across from me and coldly said, "You have to leave. Pack your suitcase and just leave." I looked at her, then at the house and the wreckage. She was right. I knew that if I stayed there one more minute, my children would be motherless and I would end up in jail. I went upstairs and packed an overnight bag. It surprised me how much control I had. All the disbelief, the denial, the tragedy just disappeared. I just needed to get away. I moved first to a motel room, then to a small apartment near our house. I was sad, of course. I was desperately unhappy, but I was a man. I could handle it. My father put up with a lot more. I could do it because I was my father's son. When I thought about telling all this to my son, because almost 20 years separated that night from the present, I wondered, even now, how I could have been so calm. In the days that followed, my son told me how scared he and Bridget had been that night. He said Bridget cried for days, but I already knew all that. Carol didn't Wait, and she didn't. Procrastinate, her great confession came. On Thursday night, she a restraining order. She found a lawyer and a vicious wanted that I was served the following Friday. At least she didn't try to get me to work. I wondered how to explain the next few nightmarish weeks to my son. I hired a lawyer. Carol had her own, and we all met at her attorney's office. Although the animosity at that meeting was toxic, we still managed to work out a pretty fair agreement. First, about the feud, I still wanted to know the reason, but she had no answer. She said she had fallen out of love with me and needed to move on. I asked her why she didn't come to me. I said that maybe if she had come, we could have worked something out. I said that she was the only woman in my life, and I couldn't imagine myself with another. And that's when she got me. She got me right between the eyes. I don't remember her exact words, but their impact reverberated in my soul for years to come. She told me that I was no longer fulfilling her needs. She had outgrown me. She said I was boring, that life with me had become tedious, that I was a pathetic nothing that was going nowhere. She said she needed filet mignon and I needed a hamburger. She really took it out on me. She told me she couldn't believe I was still a virgin when we met on the beach. She said that her boyfriend Vernon Smithers had already her, and even later while we were dating. Oh my God. Vernon Smithers. She told me she only dated me because her parents made her break up with Vernon. She said she kind of liked me but never really loved me, that I was just someone her parents thought was suitable. She said that I was comfortable with me but never passionate, not for her. It was painful, very painful. It was like Carol was reading my mind. She just sat there and smirked. Carol said she couldn't believe that all the time we were in high school, me in college and her in nursing school, I hadn't done anything. I told her that wasn't true. She told me that throughout nursing school she had 4 or 5 boyfriends every year. I said I didn't believe her, but she really got me. She started naming men, dates, and places. They all roughly coincided with the times we had brief spats. She told me I was a fool all the way through. Admittedly, I was utterly crushed, and as I watched her story, I could see that she was enjoying every minute of it. I suppose the revelation of the kind of person she was far worse for me than the breakup and divorce itself. Yet I sensed that something else was going on with Carol that day at the lawyer's office. All of her comments were too formulaic, as if rehearsed. Everything she said was probably true, but I remember thinking, even as she was ranting, that all of this could be payback for the house and the curio, but it could be more than that. She took a breath a couple times, and in between she said, you need someone better. You need someone you can count on. Yes, I remember thinking it wasn't just anger at the house, but guilt, and not just guilt over her affair with the doctor. I was just too upset at the time to realize it. Carol had her own demons, but if you think about it, all those years, everything we'd done, the years of saving, the conversations, the dreams I thought we shared, none of it meant anything to her. I was an in-between, a thing to be used. Going into this meeting, I thought I hated her. By the time she was done, I realized it. I looked across the table at her and felt nothing. She was dead to me. I think she saw it in my eyes. Settlement. I was pleasantly surprised by the court's decision, at least at first. Carol wanted the house and she got it. We just refinanced our mortgage. We put more money down and the interest in Payments were quite low. Carol grinned crookedly about the house. It was just the way she had planned it before the confession. She had planned it that way. Carol always managed the money. It never occurred to me to find out or confirm how much she made. How surprised I was. She actually made a little less than I did. We divided our savings equally, but what did it matter? Most of it had already gone into the house. She was generous with child support and didn't demand it. Of course, there was a price to pay for that. I could have stalked her and Gilmore at work. Interesting premise. I could have deprived them of their jobs. Gilmore would have suffered a minor injury, but his skills were such that he would have recovered quickly. Carol, on the other hand, would have been scored. But if she burned out, I would be burned out too. I decided to let her keep her job. Let her keep her new lover. I just wanted out. She was good with the kids, with them. She could hurt me with my destruction of the house and the fact that I pushed her. She had everything she needed to destroy me. She had proof. I knew it. She had mailed me pictures of what I had done. Yes, when it came to the kids, there was a bit of the old Carol in them. The Carol I loved. I got every other weekend in one school night a week. She promised not to create obstacles. I supposed it wouldn't be easy at first because I'd need a decent place to live, but I figured I'd figure that out. Eventually there was one more hurdle, and it was a big one. I'd practically ransacked the house. Carol demanded reimbursement for all her personal losses. I agreed, and the amount was substantial. I agreed to this because the physical damage was my fault. Finally, she agreed to split the legal fees with the exception of personal property and our cars. All other property, whatever it was divided equally. Ardo, I remembered reaching across the table to Carol at the end of the meeting. She jerked her hands away. I said, I want to thank you. She looked embarrassed. She recoiled even further. She looked at me, perplexed, as if she had forgotten something, as if there was an asset somewhere that she had missed. She asked, why then? I said, Carol, maybe our marriage was a sham, and maybe everything I thought we built is just ashes in the wind, but I still want to thank you. She looked surprised. I continued, I want to thank you for the 20 happiest years of my life. I want to thank you for all the dreams I thought we once shared. I want to thank you for our 2 wonderful children. I stopped and took a sip of water. I wasn't thinking about the kids and how they would always connect us. No, I was thinking about the fact that this might be the last time I see her. I concluded, I know it's over between us. Our life together is dead, but I still have the memories. Carol, I will always remember you. I loved you once, and I will always remember you as that beautiful girl who once made all my dreams come true. She started to cry. I had to get up and walk away. I walked away a broken man. My wife, the woman I loved with all my heart, was not at all the perfect person I had envisioned. All my illusions were shattered, and then it got worse. I was able to see the kids, and she stayed out of it, but she started filling the kids with poison. I was being stupid, out of control. I was tearing the house apart, so it was always there. Carol started turning everything good we ever did into bad. She fed them half-truths and often outright lies. They were young, only 11 and 9 years old, and it was easy for them to believe what she was saying. It didn't take long, and soon they started finding reasons not to see me. It didn't make sense. Carol was still angry, and I couldn't understand why she'd gotten everything she wanted. Not only had I Lost my wife and family, but my children as well. Then the small mercy started to appear. First, I needed a decent place to live. I didn't have the money to buy anything, but my mom was there for me all the way. What did I know? Mom and Dad had been saving money all their lives. Mom talked to my brother and sister and convinced them to understand and even help a little. The three of them put together a small down payment, and I was able to buy an apartment on the second floor. It had 3 bedrooms, 1 full bathroom with a whirlpool tub, and a second bathroom with a toilet and sink. The condo was also part of a larger configuration that included a gym and a large outdoor pool. No, it wasn't a real house, but it was pretty darn close. My kids could find ways to not see me, but when they did, it wasn't in some cheap, dilapidated apartment. Then came small mercy number 2, and it was inadvertently provided by Carol. Just a few months after our divorce, she married Dr. Gilmore. That's good news. Yes, good news for me and the kids. Suddenly, good old mommy had a new life. She became too busy to take care of her children. My kids began to see a different side of mommy that none of us had realized, but they also began to see a few new options. They could visit Jenny MC Fro regularly, and soon other babysitters, as Carol and her new man settled into their new home, where they could choose to spend more time with their nasty daddy. They would take their dad with them, his pool, his gym, and of course, regular visits to Dad's school. The kids were young but not stupid. Carol was hurting them with her indifference. I saw that pain. I was ready to wipe away their tears. Then Carol gave me an even better, no, the best blessing. She got pregnant. I finally realized why she had avoided getting her tubes tied all this time. She had been looking forward for new accomplishments. Did I believe that? I wasn't sure, but Dr. Gilmore wanted children of his own, and Carol was only too happy to help. So 2 years after our divorce, I started seeing the kids more often than Carol did, and since they had bought a new house, the kids needed a school change. Guess what? Yes, we switched the kids. Carol alternated between weekends and 1 day a week. I had the kids the rest of the time. My life was changing, and for the better, but there were other things that weren't so good. One of them was work. For a long time, I was fine. Really fine. No one realized what was going on. Sure, on the rare occasions when Carol showed up, they noticed she was missing. But no one, well, almost no one knew the truth. Of course, that didn't help. I became a ghost at work. The truth about my failed marriage leaked out. What did I expect? My kids were with me at all the games. The students at my school were curious. Yes, Mr. Wark's wife left him for some doctor. It became like a Robert Louis Stevenson novel. Dr. Jekyll disappeared, and Mr. Hyde took up residence in the house, and with that came a corresponding loss of respect. Of course, another bad thing, a very bad thing, was the issue of my self-esteem. Carol had not only broken my heart, she had successfully lied to me and hidden her true self from me for almost 20 years. I wondered if that was really true. It was hard to accept, and yet I guessed it was true, or I was too blind, or just too stupid. I had to make amends for my stupidity. I wasn't going to get revenge on Carol. That ship had sailed, but I had to prove something. Was I a man, really a man? There was only one thing to do, and for the first 6 months or so I did just that. I went to every tavern, every bar, at every night spot in the neighborhood. I found women, met them, entertained them, and dumped them. I hit on every woman I saw. I made an ass out of myself. I had a lot of girlfriends. I didn't fall for anything, but that didn't mean anything. The more I got, the more miserable I got. Of course, I visited many of the night spots that Carol's friends frequented. I never planned it. It just happened. By then, I had remodeled my entire closet and bought a new car. I was constantly going to the gym or the pool. I got fit and gained muscle mass. Sooner or later, it was bound to happen. Several of Carol's nurse friends saw me with a blonde. They saw me doing something I rarely did with Carol, dancing and having fun. Rumors reached Carol. She never called, and I never saw her when I left the house or anything like that. Carol was furious. I wondered, why was she furious? Why did she even bring this up with the kids? What was her problem? Hadn't she won? Didn't she get what she wanted? These were just more questions that had no answers. Part 2. Salvation comes with red hair and freckles. I must have been killing myself, and I know it showed at work. How do I know? It manifested at work. I knew because it took another woman to reveal it to me. I have to admit, I always noticed Miss Fitzgerald. She had the look. 5 foot tall, dark reddish brown hair, freckled skin like buttermilk, green eyes, and she acted like the classic Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. She certainly looked different than Carol, and I mean, almost everyone liked her, including me, including the kids at school. Well, the kids didn't just like her, they adored her. They were crazy about her. But not everyone liked her. She had her detractors. Sometimes I wondered if some teacher dislike of her was due to jealousy. A silly thought, of course it was. I left her alone. She taught history, in my opinion, one of the most boring subjects in the school program, but she made it interesting. She ran the school store, and after school she ran a music program where she taught the banjo to the worst slackers in the school. I remember my first interaction with Miss Fitzgerald after my divorce. I was sitting at my desk in my office with the door open. I used to do that a lot. People were usually afraid of me, not in the sense that I would hit them, but because I was the principal and could mess up schedules and things like that. Not that I really ever did. So Carol left me, and I guess I became something of a pathetic, tough guy at work, but I had an excuse. I was in pain. I was sitting at my desk, feeling proud, strong, and admittedly insecure when a tiny, skinny, flat-chested Sheena Fitzgerald walked past my door. She looked inside and must have seen or sensed something. She stopped, turned, and walked. In closing the door behind her, she headed for my desk. I didn't realize it yet, but my life was about to change. Again, Miss Fitzgerald walked and sat down and began to speak. Brad, she said, I can see that you are troubled. I want to help. What was it? I was her boss, her principal, and she was using my name. I replied, Miss Fitzgerald, putting emphasis on the miss. I'm perfectly fine. Is there anything I can help you with? She smiled at me, then she launched into one of the most interesting litanies I have ever heard. Mr. Warrer, Brad, she said, I am almost 32 years old. I'm not one of the prettiest girls around. I have a 5-year-old daughter with a loser father. But I know I can help. I thought, not a bad warm up. After all, I was a teacher, and the old whine and moan, you don't know how bad I feel at home, was always a pretty standard phrase for kids who wanted something. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't let me. She was too busy throwing punches. She said, I see, Brad. You're stuck. You're in a hole, and you Don't know how to get out, believe me. I've been there. I stood up, walked out from behind the desk, and headed for the door, holding out my right hand to lead her out of the office. I said, "Look here, Miss Fitzgerald." She wasn't going to stop. I should have known better, for I had seen her work with her students. She was a real Energizer bunny, Mr. War. Everyone knows what happened. Everyone else is sorry, but I'm not. I decided you needed my help. I've seen your kids. They're a couple of cute babes, and Jesus, she was freaking me out. I lowered my hand and took a step back without stopping. She kept coming at me. Yes, I realized a blatant signal or a subliminal message of insecurity. Either way, I was going to regain the advantage before she could get a word out. I stopped, stood up, and said, "Miss Fitzgerald, you're personal." I tried to turn off my all-factory system. Family history is irrelevant. She was wearing one of her usual self-regulating uniforms, a sexless business suit of thick tweed. I tried to focus my gaze on her face. She kept averting her eyes. I sort of tried to finish the sentence. The importance to me, other than for me, it was getting on my nerves. I may have to write a statement on her. I tried to finish. How can they then? She stepped back, uncertainty replaced by confidence. "Tomorrow," she said, finally turning and walking out of my office. While I thought, where did that come from? It took me a few seconds to regain my aplomb, but I did. What had I just experienced? It was obvious. One of three things. One, she genuinely believed she could be a friend. Two, she was responding to some teacher's wager, some audacity. Or three, she was a __ and saw me as just another conqueror. I came to the conclusion that it was either door number 2 or number 3. I knew what I had to do. She had to leave. I had to kick her the hell out of my school. I walked around and sat back down at my desk. Dr. the Shields, Mrs. Ariana the Shields, was my supervisor. I picked up the phone. I'll call Ariana and arrange for Miss Fitzgerald's transfer. She was only a history teacher. There were plenty of history teachers, and she would be gone in less than a week. I called and was put through to Mrs. Des Shields' secretary. She informed me that Dr. De Shields was out of the office. She was dealing with a problem at another school. Damn, I thought, guessing where she was. They were having problems at Westwood High School a few days ago. On the phone, she had mentioned that changes were coming at Westwood. On the air, she mentioned that transfers were coming. Westwood was a toilet. I knew their principal, and he was incompetent. Half the staff was incompetent. It got me thinking about the politics of the school system. All school systems did that. Principals, and I was one of them, never went to the wall to fire a teacher. It was damn hard. Too many variables: race, gender, age, seniority, unions, politicians, relatives, coaching. We just translated them over and over. Eventually, all these lemons, it was called the Lemon Dance, ended up at the same school. At the time, Westwood was a lemon pit. Ariana practically offered me a position. No way. There was no way I was leaving Oakrest, my school, for Westwood. If I had talked to Ariana about Sheena, she would have just as readily transferred me to Westwood. I didn't want to go there, and I certainly couldn't let them send Sheena to a place like that. The lazy wolves there would tear her to shreds. Besides, if I managed to transport Miss Fitzgerald, I might end up with some loser. I thanked Dr. D. Shields' secretary and told her that my call was strictly social. I would call back later. I asked her not to even tell me I had Called as I hung up the phone, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had foolishly forgotten all the prime directives of school teachers and administrators. Competent people are always expected to be able to handle their problems without crying out for help. I had to handle my problem on my own. The next day, Miss Typically Tweed business suit Sheena Fitzgerald came in, wearing a pale green blouse of the finest soft fabric, the most seductive imaginable. The color matched the emerald of her eyes perfectly. The dark green and black miniskirt, black sandals, and black stiletto shoes elicited the expected reaction from not only me but every single person in the school. Oh yeah, I get it. Miss Fitzgerald was a for hire. Women are all the same. Every time I turned around, she was in or near the main office, my home ground. It was quite obvious to me what she was up to, and I had to recognize that she was putting me at a disadvantage. Worse, at the end of the workday, as I was walking to my car to leave, she pestered me and insisted that I help her carry some boxes to her car. When I helped and finished, she stood up on her toes and touched my cheek. I immediately thought of Carol. She said she hoped to meet me Friday after school. She said she would be at the Denny's restaurant near our school. She said she would wait outside. I told her she was wrong to think I would be there. I told her I could lose my job. She replied that I could only lose my job if she complained, and that would never happen. She said I need someone and she thinks she can help. I told her she was crazy. She just smiled. That was on a Wednesday. Hiding in my office, I went through Thursday and Friday without any direct contact, but it wasn't because she wasn't trying. Every once in a while I would sneak a furtive glance at her. I had to admit that as thin as she was very pretty, just a tidbit. Nothing like my ex-wife Winter had. Come Friday turned out to be a cold, frosty Friday. I was sure Miss Fitzgerald wasn't stupid enough to think she could stand outside in a cold parking lot and think I was coming over. Nevertheless, just out of curiosity, I decided to drive by. She was there. She looked cold. It was ridiculous. I pulled into the parking lot, got out of the car intending to give her a stiff lecture while I walked her to her car. I got out, walked over, and started to speak. Miss Fitzgerald, she smiled, waved, and headed toward me. Stupid me, I had foolishly parked so that my car was on the opposite side of the restaurant entrance to walk her to her car. We have to meet at the damn front door. She walked over to me, took my hand, and started leading me to the door, laughingly saying, I think you look like a Grand Slam to me. The Grand Slam was my favorite dish on the menu at Denny's. I grumbled, I can't stay long, maybe just coffee. By then she had squeezed my hand in the crook of her elbow. We'll see, she said. School affairs had been going on since the first school opened in Colonial, Massachusetts, but they were almost always conducted with at least a modicum of discretion. Over the years, I've caught a few of these instances. I remember once going into the bookroom of the English department to get a copy of the 10th grade course of study. As I entered, I found one of our young female teachers entertaining my English department chair. They looked up, saw me, parted, quietly adjusted their outfits, and disappeared out the door. Nothing was said. I wondered, is this what Sheena wanted? Some Todd Ray affair? Yes, I guess so. I couldn't imagine anything else. Sheena and I were sitting at a Table across from each other at Denny's. Restaurant, I warned her it's only a one-time thing. I only stopped because I couldn't let you stand outside in the cold. Her eyes fluttered open and I thought, who was she kidding? She replied, no, you wouldn't have let me because you're a gentleman. She shifted in her seat and continued, you know I've been in love with you ever since you came to Oakrest. My husband left me and our daughter just a few weeks before you arrived. He crushed me in the divorce. I don't mean the money, but the way he treated me. What he said, I saw you with the children. You were so beautiful. You were so happy. I'm sorry, but I can tell you that almost from the day your wife left you, I don't know the details, but I know what happened. She reached across the table and took my hand. Please let me help. If anything, Sheena was not reticent. She was open and honest about her intentions. I had my doubts. Maybe she wasn't pretending to be a coward. At the same time, I felt that I had to explain to her plainly, Miss Fitzgerald, I appreciate your interest, your sympathy, but I want to warn you that I don't see you as a handsome man. She swayed back and laughed. My God, I hope not. No one ever has, and no one ever will know. I just want us to be friends. We're already soulmates. I've already been through this. We can swap stories. I know I can help. I was shocked. Then first I knew and saw that my comment about asexuality had hurt her. Second, I knew she was lying. Half the men and most of the boys wanted her. Third, I wondered if I needed her help. I decided I didn't, but I wanted to keep seeing her. It occurred to me that I liked her not as a woman, not as a potential conqueror, but as a person, just a person. I corrected my comment. I didn't mean that I didn't think you were beautiful. You are very beautiful. In any other circumstance, I would certainly be interested, but we are colleagues. I have a school to run. Yes, I think we can be friends, but to be professional as well. She smiled and nodded. Let's have a play date. I'll bring my girlfriend. You bring your kids and we can talk. I noticed that she had very long eyelashes, and from the way she threw back her hair, I realized that she was wearing semicircle-shaped earrings that I guessed had tiny emeralds in them. She had small round pierced ears with tiny lows. Of velvety strand of reddish hair seemed to run down, covering a little of her left. I felt like I should reach up and pull them back so I could see her better. But I didn't. I said, okay, pick a day and time. Sheena looked at the ceiling, then at me. Not this weekend. How about next Saturday? You decide what and where. I said, no, you decide. She said, no, you're the man. You decide. I hadn't heard anything like that in years. I tried my best not to puff up my chest. Okay, next Saturday I'll let you know where and what. Next week we stood up together, shook hands, and I walked her to her car. She had a Volkswagen, a far cry from what Carol preferred at her car. We shook hands again. I helped her into the seat, stepping aside as she started the car and drove off. I watched her as she drove out of the parking lot. As soon as she pulled away, I started to have doubts. I checked my watch. I needed to hurry so I could get home before the kids arrived later that night. After putting the kids to bed, I foolishly pulled out some old pictures of Carol and me. When she left, she hadn't taken any pictures of me, just a few of our kids, and she left me our wedding album. I don't know why I did it, but I went through the old photos. It was so sad. I don't know why, but I cried. I knew I would have to end my relationship with Miss Fitzgerald before anything would change. The following Monday, I was on hallway duty when Miss Fitzgerald came in from the station to get the morning mail and student list. I think the expression on my face gave me away. She saw me and turned pale. Her bright, cheerful face turned ashy gray. I chickened out. I covered my face with a smile and headed straight for her good morning. The teachers and students said I made no attempt at discretion. Loudly and deliberately I proclaimed, there is a skating rink a few blocks from my house. We could take the kids skating and then have lunch at my place. Teachers, students, and staff walked by. They heard every word but pretended not to hear. I knew that by the end of the day everyone in the building would know that Miss Fitzgerald and I were keeping company. Miss Fitzgerald looked uncertain. I was sure my first face had alarmed her, and now she just didn't know. She replied, I never learned to skate, and my child. I very gently reached out and touched her hand. Wonderful, I can be your teacher. She finally really smiled, but I could still tell she wasn't quite sure. And she replied, okay, let's do it. Coincidentally, it was the first week of the month. Most principals used the first Monday for faculty meetings. I preferred the first Tuesday. Mondays were bad enough as it was the next day. That Tuesday when we met in the cafeteria, I sort of discreetly nodded to the table closest to me when Sheena walked in. She took the hint and sat up front. I was determined not to hide anything. People would gossip anyway. I wanted everyone to know that this was about friendship and not some sordid affair. The faculty meeting followed the usual path. They all suck after the department chairs and athletic director gave their usual speeches. I asked for questions or comments. This was my __ time. I received the usual questions. Why are we enforcing this or that rule? Shouldn't someone be in the cafeteria making the kids clean up after themselves with trash? Why aren't you banning kids from eating in the hallways? And the always audible, I won't attend meetings where prayer will be read. I listened to all of these complaints, reminded everyone to listen to the morning announcements of school closings or delayed openings on WKRP, and then reminded them one last time that we are all in the building to teach and that we all need to remember that. I wanted to end with a prayer, but I knew that any such move would result in a call from Dr. Des Shields. I thought about my school. I thought about some of my teachers. I thought about Miss Fitzgerald. I thought about prayer in school. There were a few teachers I didn't like. There was a small group of teachers who I privately referred to as headhunters. These were teachers who seemed to devote their lives to catching kids who broke the rules. The district had a system-wide rule about leather coats. Kids were not supposed to wear leather coats to school. This was aimed at a few schools where theft was common. We had no such problems. But there were a couple of teachers who seemed to enjoy catching and punishing kids for their outfits. One of them was a particularly mean older woman. She couldn't teach worth a damn, but she sure knew the rules of behavior for her students. One day, one little girl got a suede coat for Christmas. Old Mrs. Nasty caught her and dragged her down the stairs to the main hallway where I usually was. Old Mrs. Nasty pointed to the girl's coat and said, "Leather coat, what are you going to do with it?" Of course it was nonsense. She just wanted to embarrass me in a crowded hall. The girl almost cried when she said, "Mr. Wariki, my coat is suede, not leather." I smiled sweetly at the child, took the coat and said, "It's okay, sweetie." I frowned looking at old Mrs. Nasty and growled, "You heard her, suede Cold old Mrs. Nasty was furious. She stomped her foot. Angrily, half a dozen children saw the whole scene and laughed. Quietly, I took the girl to the main office where I calmly explained what swayed was. Later in the afternoon, I received a printout from old Mrs. Nasty in which the definition of swayed was highlighted in yellow marker. Then there were the mounting nuts. We had several elderly ladies who insisted that every meeting in the auditorium begin with a prayer. I never had a problem with that. They always mentioned Jesus, but none of my other faith teachers ever complained. Of course, there was assembly duty. Several teachers always had to be on standby to keep an eye on the kids. I had two nasty younger teachers who had wild birds up their asses. They threatened that if there was ever again an assembly starting with prayer, they would refuse to be on assembly duty. I meekly agreed. They were relieved of duty. I reassigned them to cafeteria duty, the worst non-teaching job in any school. I chuckled quietly to myself at the thought of them standing in the middle of the cafeteria with kids throwing food particles at them for 25 minutes. Why was I thinking about those hateful teachers? I thought of them because I knew that most of them had a special hatred for Miss Fitzgerald. Poor Sheena was constantly being called on the carpet by one assistant principal or another. Sheena tried to do something about it. She held mock trials in her classroom. She planned and took the kids on field trips. She, God forbid, even allowed the kids to go to the bathroom during class time. In other words, little Sheena Fitzgerald, as a creative, innovative teacher, was hated by the "that's not my job" crowd. Okay, I was weak, but I guess I liked Miss Fitzgerald if I was careful. If I kept a low profile, no one could complain and I could make a friend. It seemed a perfectly acceptable idea. Oh no, I was wrong. After that, it all went downhill from there. We went ice skating. I hadn't skated since my divorce. Bridget had gone skating but never learned. Brad Junn, however, skated pretty well. We went ice skating. Bridget fell. Sheena fell. Sheena's girl Laura fell. I even fell down. It was fun. After riding, we went back to the condo, made homemade pizza, and watched a video. We watched an old Disney thing called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Even Brad Junn liked it. Like I said, it all went downhill from there. My kids fell in love with it. I still had serious trust issues, but Sheena proved she was the real deal. We started dating in earnest. After our first real date, she insisted that all subsequent dates be attended by my kids and her. Laura, this Sheena was great. Sheena gave it her all. She didn't hold anything back. She told my kids right away that she didn't want to be their mother, but wanted to be my friend and help where she could. I was ready. I never believed it could happen again. I kept waiting for another shoe to drop, for something bad to happen. It was crazy. Nothing bad was happening. My life was getting better and better. I sat down and looked at the notes I had made for my son. I knew there were more things I needed to add. Who was Sheena? What had happened to her? What bad things had she told me? What role did she play, and how did she become such an important part of everything we did? Some things young Brad knew, but I felt like he still needed to hear what he didn't know. I remembered how I had suffered after the divorce. I was lonely, embittered, despairing, and had a deep sense of inadequacy. I especially remembered the loneliness, how it gwetted me. It's the kind of thing that can eat a person up from the inside out. I felt that I didn't meet all the Requirements I wasn't good enough. I remembered constantly wondering where I had failed. Had I failed in my role as breadwinner, father, lover? I just didn't. No, Carol never said. I remember desperately needing answers, a denouement. But it never came. Somehow Sheena sensed it. She seemed to know we talked. It wasn't easy. She was a woman, and I had developed a healthy distrust of the opposite sex after I decided to honor her request. For a date, I went back to my high school records and checked her background. I learned very little. She graduated from a fairly ordinary state college just like me. She was a little younger than me and had a young daughter. There was no mention of a husband, so I first assumed she had had a child out of wedlock, and what she said about the divorce was a lie. A bad divorce can have that effect on a person. I noticed that she had changed her name. Admittedly, I was paranoid. I had her address, so I drove by her apartment complex and watched. I wanted to see if she was seeing someone else. Maybe she's just reaching out to me. Maybe she's sneaking off after work to some joint. It was hard for me to take the risk and try to trust another person. It was so hard. Our first dates were homemade, the simplest. We'd go to Denny's or Texas Roadhouse, and usually a movie was a cheap skate. Yes, but I didn't know that this woman, I just knew I had to be careful to find out as much as I could. Was I surprised? I learned so much that I felt like I was reading a book. I guess I was. And the subject matter was already familiar to me. She told me her story, and in the process of telling me, she set me free. Her story played out one night when our children were asleep in their rooms. Brad, June, and his, and Laura with Bridget, Sheena, and I spent another wonderfully restless time tossing and turning in my bed. Back to Sheena's story. Like me, she fell in love with her high school sweetheart, but not like me. They avoided using birth control. In junior high, Sheena found herself with child. Her boyfriend wanted an abortion, but Sheena wouldn't give up. They got married and both managed to work and still finish college. Sheena's uncle was a judge. He made some calls and she ended up in Oak Crest. Her husband became a car salesman. He sold Saabs. I heard rumors. I doubted they were true, but I heard that only vain jerks bought Saabs. I only bought Fords or Chevrolets, so it didn't matter. She said he was a good salesman, but a bad husband and lover, according to her. She never fully understood what slam bam thank you ma'am meant until she got married. He never hurt her, but according to her, he wasn't very affectionate. He tried to chase her and get her to come back, but she returned home to her parents. Her husband tried to take their girl, but her father got a restraining order, and when her uncle found her a good lawyer, her husband finally backed off. The divorce went through and she was left practically alone with only Laura. Of course, her mom and dad wouldn't let that happen. Laura was just a baby at the time, and Sheena's mom came to her rescue. As I listened to Sheena, I realized that as bad as my divorce was, her divorce was even worse. Carol or her doctor ever threatened me or feared physical harm. No one ever twisted my arms. I realized that I had fallen in love with Sheena, and it scared me. I was afraid to make a new commitment. She saw right through me. She told me some of the things her husband had told her. Toward the end, she said he had gone from angry to despondent. He told her that he was already seeing someone else, someone better in bed, someone who appreciated him, and that this new and better someone had money. Then he would get sad. And guilty he would cry and whine that she was too good for him, that he needed someone not so honorable and not afraid to get dirty. At the very end, she said that her husband had confessed everything he had affairs, he had been with several other women. He told her he did it because it was exciting, it was always an adventure, and he knew he could get away with it. He said she was boring and he just couldn't imagine himself living with her for the rest of his life. I listened and realized that Sheena's husband was saying a lot of what Carol was saying or trying to say. To me, I thought it must be part of the common lamentations infidels use to justify their wickedness. Yes, Carol and Sheena's husband were evil, brutally evil people. But they were both right about one thing. Neither of them was good enough for the one they betrayed. As I listened to Sheena's story, I realized why Carol had to divorce me. It wasn't about work or money or power or prestige. It was because Carol always knew I was better than Carol. She was the one who was inferior. She was the one who failed, not me. I got Sheena to agree to give up her apartment and move her and her daughter into my place. A few weeks later, Sheena and I sat our kids down at the table and had the big talk. They were above us. Shortly thereafter, Sheena and I bonded in marriage. In attendance were her parents, my siblings with their children, and a few of our teacher friends. I loved her, truly loved her. I had finally found happiness again. I had found fulfillment. I believed she had too. Of course, my feelings for Carol had changed. I no longer hated her. I felt sorry for her. It seemed that while my life was getting better, Carol had already had one child with Dr. Gilmore, but she'd broken up with him. Looks like she found someone even better. She sued Gilmore to get a divorce and start openly dating a heart surgeon. I didn't know what to think. We dated for almost 6 years and were married for 12. Before she took me up on it, she'd been with Gilmore for a little over 3. I was sure there was more to the story. I thought Carol was sick. Carol got divorced. Did she see a heart surgeon? Yes, she did, and from what I hear, she's supposedly happily married, but you never know with Carol. I knew one thing. I once thought I'd gotten everything I wanted, but I saw it turn to dust. Now I realized that I had been given a second chance and I had taken full advantage of it. Epilogue. Carol's story is long over for me. But whenever Brad Jenner stopped by our house, he always had something to say about his mom. He was worried about her. He said that every time he stopped by, she would only talk about me, her, and our long dead marriage. He said she seemed to be dwelling too much on the past. One day, she said she was a little sorry she divorced me. I was sorry too at the time. I even feel sorry for Carol now. I think she's looking for something she'll never find. She came to Brad Jenner years wedding, but she didn't bring anyone. I thought she had a heart surgeon she could bring. She looked as beautiful as ever. I danced with her once at the reception and she still felt good in my arms. I still remembered her perfume. We talked and laughed about old things. About halfway through the dance, I noticed that Carol was hugging herself. I was a little embarrassed and felt awkward. I looked over at Sheena. She was smiling. She saw it too. I thought, that's my girl. I was a little surprised Carol had mentioned Vernon Smithers. I'm not sure, but I think I heard that this guy had his own machine shop. I wondered if maybe Carol's mom and dad shouldn't have separated them. I thought that maybe Carol had found what she was looking for at 16, but Was robbed of. It was sad in a way back to the real world shortly after Sheena and I got married. We had to buy something bigger. Then an apartment. Now there are 8 of us, counting Junior and his wife, and of course Bridget and Laura. Sheena and I have since added 2 more, Sean, who is now 10, and Eileen, who is only 7. Sheena has given up teaching lately. She's lost a little weight, looking softer, even prettier if that's possible. She says she likes staying home, says she enjoys cooking and taking care of the kids. She still visits Oak Crest often. She teaches banjo playing and tutors SATs part-time. I'm okay with all of that. I will say this: Sheena can have or do whatever she wants, and that's a fact. I see that Brad Jr. just pulled up to the house. He's only been married a couple years. I hope I'm ready for what he wants to hear. I hope things work out with his wife. She's a good girl. If not, we'll be there for him. That's what parents do. One last thing. Am I happy? That's a stupid question. The end.